From the taxation of trade routes to the collapse of democracy, from a supremely powerful galactic empire to a rebel insurgency, the Star Wars saga often tells us about its world by reference to the politics of our world. This is somewhat surprising from a franchise known for being a swashbuckling space adventure, and people can't seem to agree on whether the films have too much political backstory or not enough. So in this video, we're going to dive into the film's portrayal of the Empire, its creation, its destruction, its resurrection, and its re-destruction through all 9 mainline films. So let's see what the politics of Star Wars has to teach us about the art of storytelling. So we'll be looking at 3 different stories with 3 different main characters who take us to 3 very different moral conclusions. But all 3 of these stories revolve around this thing called the Galactic Empire. Our first look at the Empire was, of course, the famous opening shot in A New Hope, in which we see the stark contrast in power of 2 opposing groups of people. This shot's really effective because it doesn't require any exposition or dialogue, it's just pure cinema. For the purposes of this film, the audience doesn't really need to know much about the Empire except that they're very powerful and very bad. That said, there is one interesting little bit of dialogue in A New Hope that spells out the political situation in the galaxy.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently.
So we're pretty quickly told that the Empire is an authoritarian military dictatorship. Everything else we can gather about the Empire is just implied. Their uniforms and rank insignia tell us that they have a rigid military hierarchy. Their ships tell us that they're technologically advanced and highly organized. And their ability and willingness to blow up entire civilizations tells us that they rule by terror and violence. In short, the Empire is unequivocally bad, and this is the necessary moral backdrop for an archetypal hero like Luke Skywalker. We don't know much about him either at this point in the story, except that he's clearly the character whom this story is about. We naturally think of Luke and the Empire as separate elements of the story, but what Luke Skywalker is and what the Empire is are thematically interdependent. One of the ways that a story can tell us what our hero is by telling us what our hero is not. The Empire has no regard for human suffering, and by implication our hero represents the opposite of that belief. Luke and the Empire are complementary opposites, each one defined by the form of the other, not unlike the balance of the Force. You could also think of it like a chessboard. A move by the dark side by implication compels a move on the light side. The morality of the story really is black and white. This is one reason why the original Star Wars movie has that mythic quality to it. There's no ambiguity about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. All our main character needs to do is believe in something bigger than himself, and he will prevail in the face of evil, and we can all go home. Except the movie made a lot of money, so sequels. Of course, episodes 5 and 6 really elevate the story with the dramatic complication of having the character who personifies the Empire turn out to be himself oppressed by the Empire. This completely changes the dramatic question of Luke's story because it complicates what the Empire is, and therefore complicates what Luke Skywalker is. The Empire isn't just a powerful military force that dominates others, the Empire also oppresses from within. You see this in the subservient smile of the terrified mid-ranking officer who must submit to the impossible demands of the Emperor.
We shall double our efforts.
This is not the face of an evil man. It is the face of an oppressed totalitarian subject. Perhaps he once believed in the cause of the Empire, which promised to restore order, but somewhere along the way, he became complicit in evils not of his own making. Now he is a prisoner, bound to the ideology of the regime, and a slave to the whims of his lunatic leader. Luke, on the other hand, shows us that the path to redemption is not to destroy the evil within another, but to deny the temptation to evil within one's own heart. All of this culminates perfectly in the story's climax, when he realizes that if he destroys the thing he hates, he'll become the thing he hates. And because the moral of this story has been so skillfully articulated in its world and character development, it can all be summed up in 2 simple shots, without a word of dialogue. Luke's story and the story of the Empire are one story. So how do the other trilogies compare? Let's start with the prequels. One of the complaints about the prequel movies was that they had too much tedious politics. I guess fans were waiting for a big space adventure and they got a Senate hearing, so I kind of get it. And we're going to go easy on George Lucas here because he's gotten too much hate for these films, and in any case, time has seemed to redeem him in the eyes of many fans.
Ironic.
Now, I do recognize that these films are deeply flawed. But I think the story of how a galactic empire was hijacked by a carefully calculated series of clandestine political maneuvers is actually the right story to tell to set up episodes 4, 5, and 6. Unfortunately, this puts George Lucas in a tough spot as a writer because the story of how an evil empire is created is just not going to be as thrilling or cinematic as the story of a group of rebel underdogs resisting that evil empire against impossible odds. The challenge is that there is no empire in this story, so there's no clear ideology to animate its villains. The politics of this world are not so neat and tidy. They are complex and nuanced, and this means the motivations of any of its characters are more difficult to discern, especially those of our main character. And as I've pointed out, if we, the audience, don't have a clear sense of the political ideology that our heroes are opposing, then we don't really know who our heroes are. This moral ambiguity kind of hangs over the entire prequel trilogy, and I suspect George Lucas introduced the Sith in part to fill the gap that the Empire once filled. Unfortunately, the films show us next to nothing about who the Sith are or what they believe. And again, this means that our characters' beliefs and motivations are, to that extent, undefined. This is too bad because the one scene in which we do get a glimpse into the mind of our main villain is by far the most intriguing moment in the prequel trilogy. Anakin's story really did need more of this kind of dialogue between him and Palpatine to make their motivations more clear. It should be noted that Anakin's story has the unique distinction of being a tragedy, and philosophers have long debated whether tragedies should be interpreted as having a moral at all. Aristotle believed that tragic stories were a form of catharsis, in which the audience is kind of warned about hubris or pride, or some other flaw in the human character. It's reasonable to assume that George Lucas was trying to draw a moral connection between Anakin's fall and the decline of freedom and democracy in the world he inhabits, and Obi-Wan's dialogue right before they duel would seem to support that.
Anakin, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy!
Personally, I always felt that Anakin's story could have been much more impactful if the politics of the galaxy in his time were more clearly articulated. But I would love to hear in the comments section what other people think about this. What do you think the moral of Anakin's story is, either in the prequels or in the entire saga? Now let's turn to the sequel trilogy, the only one not helmed by its original author, and I think it shows. This story doesn't seem to be very interested in the history or politics of the galaxy at all. In a way, the writers had an even greater challenge here, because the story told in episodes 1 through 6 had a very conclusive ending. The Empire is destroyed, rather decisively. Palpatine is killed, and Anakin is redeemed. And that means there isn't really much of a story left to tell in that world with those characters. That said, when I heard Disney was going to give us episodes 7, 8, and 9, I was really excited because I was intrigued by the idea that the Empire had somehow survived, and I was very curious to see what kind of characters would inhabit that world. I've heard that the original concept for the introduction of episode 7 was a derelict Star Destroyer being dumped on Jakku, with shots that would mirror the opening shot of A New Hope. A fellow YouTuber has beautifully animated this hypothetical scene here. It's really too bad this idea was abandoned because the story really needed to acknowledge the destruction of the Empire in order to turn the page in the Star Wars saga and deliver a meaningful story in that universe. And the ruins of the Empire is a fascinating setting. It's really easy to imagine compelling characters with interesting motivations and relationships in the collapsing scenery of a toppled political regime. I see an ex-stormtrooper torn between his old imperial allegiances and a resurgent galactic order, an ambitious demagogue in a divided New Republic who blames the Jedi for the rise of the Empire and believes they should be cleansed from the galaxy, a lovable ex-imperial droid who is rescued from an abandoned Star Destroyer and has to gradually learn to trust his liberators, a mysterious villain who seeks to take advantage of political chaos in order to attain personal power for his own nefarious ends, and a junk scavenging heroine who is misunderstood, persecuted, and hunted for having mysterious powers that she doesn't understand and must learn to control. All the pieces of a new Star Wars story are there, but the writers didn't do the work of thinking through the politics of a post-imperial galaxy. Instead, they just copy-pasted the Empire and rebranded it the First Order. The most we learn about them is this speech from Hux, who accuses the New Republic of acquiescing to disorder before destroying it. You'll have to refer to Wikipedia for the relevant details beyond that. By the time we get to the final order of the Rise of Skywalker, the politics of the galaxy have become so convoluted and far-fetched that they're just an absurd spectacle, and it's totally unclear what Rey is fighting against and fighting for. And to be honest, I don't remember how that movie ended, so just have to leave it there. So I think there's a strong case to be made here that George Lucas's love of history and politics is a big part of the reason why those stories worked to the extent that they did. Whether you think he failed or succeeded in telling his story, I think we should at least credit him for trying to tell a meaningful story about the nature of power, the role of the state, the responsibilities of the individual. If the Star Wars saga continues, I think it would really benefit from a re-injection of the historical and political themes from his films. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you on the next one.